Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. The year is 1917, and the world is engulfed in the chaos of World War I. For nearly 3 years, the United States has managed to stay on the sidelines, maintaining a stance of neutrality despite the global conflict raging across Europe. But by April 1917, everything changes, and the United States declares war on Germany, dramatically altering the course of history. The question is, what led to this dramatic shift in policy? Why did the U.S., a nation once committed to staying out of the conflict, decide to join the war? Was it a single event, or was the decision shaped by a combination of military, economic, and diplomatic factors? In this video, we will explore the key events, decisions, and underlying causes that pushed America into the trenches of World War I, and how this pivotal moment would go on to reshape the nation's role on the world stage. Let's dive into the factors that led to this fateful decision and examine why the United States could no longer remain on the sidelines. In the years leading up to 1917, President Woodrow Wilson and the American public were largely committed to maintaining a stance of neutrality. Wilson, in particular, was adamant about keeping the United States out of the European conflict, framing it as a moral stand for the country's ideals. He believed that America's role was to be a mediator of peace, rather than a participant in the war. Wilson's vision for the United States was rooted in the idea that the country should not be dragged into European entanglements, especially in a conflict that had no direct bearing on American security or interests. However, public opinion in the United States was far from uniform. Many Americans were deeply divided over the issue of whether to get involved. The country had a large population of immigrants from both the Allied and Central Powers, which created a complex web of loyalties. German Americans tended to sympathize with the Central Powers, while British Americans and others of Anglo-Saxon descent leaned toward supporting the Allies. These internal divisions made it difficult for Wilson to gauge the nation's true stance and further complicated his policy of neutrality. While Wilson and many Americans sought to stay out of the war, economic ties to both sides of the conflict were already in place. The United States was a major trading partner for both the Allies and the Central Powers. Early on, America primarily supplied arms, food, and other materials to the Allies, particularly Great Britain and France, as they struggled to hold their ground against Germany and Austria-Hungary. These economic exchanges not only provided substantial profits to American businesses, but also helped to increase the nation's economic interest in the war's outcome. At the same time, American banks and financial institutions were heavily invested in loans to the Allies. The financial relationship between the United States and the Allied powers grew stronger over time, particularly as British naval blockades prevented goods from reaching the Central Powers. This one-sided trade dynamic further strained the concept of neutrality, as it was clear that American prosperity was increasingly tied to the success of the Allies. Yet despite these economic ties, President Wilson carefully avoided direct involvement in the war. He tried to use diplomatic channels to negotiate peace, and he presented the United States as a potential arbitrator of the conflict. However, the pressures of war, both from external events and growing domestic sentiment, began to erode this neutrality. As the conflict deepened, both sides took measures that directly affected American citizens and interests, forcing Wilson to reassess his policy. As the war raged on in Europe, the United States found it harder to maintain its stance of neutrality. By 1917, the global landscape had shifted dramatically, and several key factors were pushing the country closer to intervention. German unrestricted submarine warfare had escalated, with Germany targeting not only military vessels but also civilian ships, including those carrying American passengers and goods. The sinking of the British liner Lusitania in 1915, which killed 128 Americans, had already sparked outrage in the U.S. But by 1917, Germany's declaration to resume unrestricted submarine warfare brought the issue to a head. The U.S. had long protested these attacks, but the German strategy grew more aggressive as they hoped to starve Britain into submission before the U.S. could intervene. The resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare was a direct challenge to American sovereignty and safety. It meant that no ship, regardless of nationality, would be safe from German attack, and the U.S. could no longer ignore the direct threat posed to its citizens and interests. In early 1917, Germany's actions made it impossible for the U.S. to remain neutral any longer. Adding to this pressure was the Zimmermann telegram, a secret diplomatic communication sent by German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico. In it, Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico in the event that the U.S. entered the war. In exchange for Mexico's support, Germany promised to help Mexico regain the territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, which it had lost in the Mexican-American War. The British intercepted the telegram and, after decrypting it, passed it on to the U.S. government. The revelation of the Zimmermann telegram caused public outrage in the United States. It was seen as a direct attempt to incite war between the U.S. and its neighbor, further antagonizing an already tense situation. It showed Germany's willingness to undermine American sovereignty and its determination to draw the U.S. into the conflict, even if it meant encouraging Mexico to go to war with the U.S. These events, combined with continued economic interest in supporting the Allies and Wilson's belief in fighting for a world safe for democracy, culminated in a speech to Congress on April 2, 1917, where President Wilson called for a declaration of war. Wilson argued that the United States could no longer stand by as a neutral power while such direct threats to its interests and its values were being made. Congress, reflecting the growing support for intervention, voted overwhelmingly to declare war on Germany on April 6, 1917. Thus, a combination of military aggression, diplomatic affronts, and economic ties pushed the United States into the conflict. The path to war had been a slow, deliberate process. But by 1917, the mounting pressures made it clear that American neutrality was no longer a viable option. On May 7, 1915, the British ocean liner RMS Lusitania was torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland. The attack killed nearly 1,200 people, including 128 American citizens. The sinking sent shockwaves through the United States. Although Britain and Germany had been locked in naval warfare, this act brought the dangers of the conflict right to America's doorstep and sparked a massive public outcry. The Lusitania was not a warship. It was a civilian passenger liner, and many Americans believed its sinking was a brutal, unjustified act. Germany, however, defended the attack by claiming the ship was carrying war materials, and in truth, it was transporting munitions alongside civilians. But that detail did little to ease American outrage. The image of innocent men, women, and children drowning in cold Atlantic waters stirred strong emotions across the country. At the heart of the crisis was Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. In an effort to blockade Britain, German U-boats began targeting not just enemy military vessels, but also neutral and civilian ships suspected of carrying supplies to the Allies. This aggressive naval strategy placed American lives and commercial interests in direct danger and began to erode the U.S.'s position of neutrality. President Woodrow Wilson, still determined to keep America out of the war, issued a series of stern diplomatic protests to Germany. He warned that any further attacks on American lives or ships would have serious consequences. Germany, hoping to avoid dragging the U.S. into the war at that stage, responded with temporary concessions. They promised to limit their submarine warfare and issued the Sussex Pledge in 1916, assuring they would not target passenger ships without warning. Despite this diplomatic back and forth, the sinking of the Lusitania had already planted a seed in the American consciousness. It exposed the vulnerability of American citizens abroad and began shifting public opinion toward the idea that the U.S. might one day need to act. While Wilson maintained neutrality for the time being, the event served as a turning point, one that made true neutrality increasingly difficult to sustain. Exactly. The Lusitania became more than just a maritime tragedy. It became a symbol of violated neutrality and innocent lives lost. Its sinking marked a psychological turning point in how Americans viewed the war. Although President Wilson held firm to diplomatic channels for nearly 2 more years, public trust in Germany had been deeply shaken. The idea that the war was a distant European conflict was no longer convincing when American civilians were being killed. By the time Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare in January 1917, the patience of both the U.S. government and the American people had worn thin. That earlier promise, made after the Lusitania, was now clearly broken. Combined with the shock of the Zimmermann telegram, the renewed U-boat threat made war seem not only justified but necessary. So while the Lusitania didn't push the U.S. across the line in 1915, it created the emotional and political groundwork that made intervention seem inevitable 2 years later. It showed the limits of neutrality in a global conflict and underscored how American lives could become entangled in foreign wars, even without a declaration. The stage was set, and the next series of events would finally tip the balance. From the very beginning of World War I, even as the United States declared its neutrality, American businesses and banks were deeply enmeshed in the conflict through trade and finance, primarily with the Allied powers. While official neutrality meant that American companies could theoretically trade with all belligerents, British naval supremacy made it nearly impossible for U.S. goods to reach Germany and its allies. The British blockade of Central Europe was highly effective, limiting American exports to the Central Powers and funneling most U.S. trade toward Britain and France. This lopsided trade relationship quickly deepened. The Allies needed weapons, food, medical supplies, and raw materials, everything a modern war machine required, and the United States became their key supplier. American manufacturers saw booming business, especially in industries like steel, agriculture, and munitions. Shipyards expanded, railroads moved goods to ports in record volume, and the economy, which had been lagging just before the war, found new energy and growth through foreign demand. But trade wasn't the only tie that bound the U.S. to the Allies. American banks, particularly firms like J.P. Morgan & Co., extended massive loans to Britain and France. By 1917, those loans totaled billions of dollars. These financial stakes mattered deeply. If the Allies lost the war, the chance of the U.S. ever seeing repayment would plummet. In effect, American financial institutions had bet heavily on an Allied victory, not necessarily out of ideology, but from cold economic calculation. This created a subtle but powerful pressure on U.S. foreign policy. While President Wilson maintained a public commitment to neutrality, there was an increasing perception, both abroad and at home, that America was economically biased toward the Allies. German leaders viewed the U.S. as a silent partner to their enemies, which partially fueled their decision to restart unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917. Meanwhile, many American leaders feared that a Central Powers victory would be a financial disaster for the country's biggest banks and trading firms. Thus, economics became a quiet but undeniable force pushing the United States toward war. It wasn't simply about ideology or even national security. It was also about protecting investments, sustaining trade relationships, and preserving the upward trajectory of the American economy. When combined with other factors, like submarine warfare, the Zimmermann telegram, and public outrage, economic interests made neutrality less realistic and war more palatable to those in power. In January 1917, one of the most explosive diplomatic revelations in American history shocked the nation and helped turn the tide toward war: the Zimmermann telegram. This coded message, sent by German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico, proposed a stunning alliance, one that would bring the war directly to the American homeland. The telegram suggested that if the United States entered World War I against Germany, Mexico should declare war on the U.S. In return, Germany promised to support Mexico in reclaiming the territories it had lost during the Mexican-American War: Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The proposal was designed to distract and preoccupy the U.S. military by forcing it to defend its southern border, thus weakening its potential involvement in Europe. However, the message was never meant to reach the public. It was transmitted in code over diplomatic channels that Germany believed were secure. What the Germans didn't know was that British intelligence had been intercepting and decrypting secret messages via a highly classified operation known as Room 40. The British cryptographers cracked the Zimmermann code and immediately understood its potential impact. At first, British officials hesitated. They worried that revealing the telegram might expose their code-breaking capabilities. But as the stakes grew higher and Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, they decided to act. In late February, they passed the decoded telegram to the United States, and shortly after, President Woodrow Wilson made it public. The reaction in America was immediate and explosive. While many had previously been hesitant about joining the European conflict, the idea that a foreign power, Germany, was actively encouraging a military threat on American soil ignited a wave of outrage. Even isolationists who had long resisted intervention were shaken by the notion that national security was now directly at risk. Although some skeptics initially questioned the authenticity of the telegram, Germany confirmed it was real, with Arthur Zimmermann himself publicly admitting to its contents in March 1917. This admission only fueled the fire. For President Wilson, the Zimmermann telegram was a critical tipping point. It provided a clear justification to rally public support, painting the war not just as a distant European conflict, but as a direct threat to American sovereignty. Coming on the heels of renewed submarine attacks on American and Allied vessels, the telegram helped convince Congress and the public that neutrality was no longer a viable path. In the broader context, the Zimmermann telegram exposed Germany's willingness to provoke war on multiple fronts, even at the risk of antagonizing a powerful neutral country. It underlined the global nature of the conflict and crystallized the view that American interests, safety, and ideals were now firmly entangled in the outcome of the war. The telegram didn't cause the U.S. to declare war by itself, but it provided the emotional and political momentum needed to make the final step seem both necessary and inevitable. In January 1917, Germany made a high-stakes gamble that would ultimately help pull the United States into World War I, the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare. After earlier suspending the practice due to American outrage over the Lusitania sinking in 1915, Germany now believed the time had come to use its powerful U-boat fleet to strike decisively. This decision wasn't made lightly. By 1917, Germany was facing crippling shortages due to the Allied naval blockade. The war had reached a brutal stalemate on the Western Front, and German military leaders believed that the only way to break the deadlock was to cut off Britain's supply lines completely, by sinking every ship, enemy or neutral, entering the waters around the British Isles. Germany's military high command argued that if they resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, they could starve Britain into submission within 6 months, before the U.S. could fully mobilize and make an impact. On the battlefield, it was a cold calculation. They understood that attacking American ships might bring the U.S. into the war, but they believed they could win before that happened. The policy was officially enacted on January 31, 1917. Almost immediately, German U-boats began targeting any ship, military or civilian, Allied or neutral, found in designated war zones. This included American vessels, despite the U.S. still being a neutral nation at the time. One of the first clear provocations came on February 3, 1917, when the American merchant ship SS Housatonic was sunk by a German submarine off the coast of Britain. Though the crew was allowed to abandon ship and survived, the act underscored a chilling truth. Germany no longer recognized American neutrality. American ships were now fair game. President Woodrow Wilson, who had long sought to keep the U.S. out of the war, was left with little choice. That same day, he broke diplomatic relations with Germany, expelling the German ambassador from Washington. It was a significant step, but not yet a declaration of war. Throughout February and March, the attacks continued. Several more American ships were torpedoed, including the California, Algonquin, and Vigilancia. Each sinking brought the U.S. closer to a point of no return. American patience was wearing thin, and public outrage was mounting. Newspapers ran headlines about German aggression and the loss of innocent American lives, fueling a wave of nationalism and support for action. The combination of Germany's aggressive new strategy and the threat exposed by the Zimmermann telegram created a perfect storm. The message was clear. Germany was not only prepared to attack American ships, but also willing to incite war on U.S. soil through secret alliances. Ultimately, unrestricted submarine warfare marked the final rupture in U.S.-German relations. It turned American neutrality into untenable hypocrisy. By treating American ships as enemy targets, Germany forced the U.S. to defend its sovereignty, its citizens, and its economic interests. This policy, more than any single event, erased the illusion that the U.S. could stay safely on the sidelines. When Wilson went before Congress on April 2, 1917, to request a declaration of war, he cited Germany's submarine campaign as one of the key provocations, proof that American honor, lives, and future could no longer be protected without joining the fight. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, President Woodrow Wilson was resolute in keeping the United States out of the conflict. He believed firmly in neutrality, both morally and politically, asserting that the U.S. should be impartial in thought as well as in action. For years, Wilson resisted mounting pressure to take sides, despite the complex web of economic interests, cultural ties, and public opinion pulling America toward the Allies. Wilson's early approach to the war was marked by diplomatic idealism. He sought to play the role of a peace broker, proposing mediation between the warring powers and hoping to usher in a new era of international cooperation. His famous Peace Without Victory speech in early 1917 encapsulated his belief that only a fair, negotiated end to the war could lead to lasting peace. But the European powers, deeply entrenched in the brutal realities of trench warfare, showed little interest in compromise. By 1917, it became increasingly clear that Wilson's peaceful aspirations were being undermined by events beyond his control. Germany's decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, as well as the shocking revelation of the Zimmermann telegram, marked a turning point. Wilson could no longer maintain the illusion of neutrality when American ships were being sunk, and foreign powers were plotting against U.S. sovereignty. Yet Wilson's decision to ask Congress for a declaration of war wasn't just a reaction to threats. It was deeply rooted in his vision for a better world. He saw the war not only as a military necessity, but as an opportunity to reshape international relations. In his eyes, American involvement in the war could lay the foundation for a new global order based on democracy, self-determination, and collective security. This idealism culminated in Wilson's 14 points, a bold framework he would unveil in 1918, but which had already taken shape in his thinking by the time he addressed Congress in April 1917. The 14 points would include proposals for open diplomacy, free trade, arms reduction, and the creation of a League of Nations, a body meant to prevent future conflicts through dialogue rather than war. On April 2, 1917, Wilson appeared before a joint session of Congress and delivered one of the most significant speeches in American history. His words were solemn, deliberate, and laced with moral conviction. He declared, "The world must be made safe for democracy." With that phrase, he framed U.S. intervention not merely as a strategic move, but as a moral crusade, an effort to defend the principles of liberty and self-rule against the forces of autocracy and aggression. Wilson acknowledged the gravity of the moment, noting the pain and sacrifice war would bring. But he emphasized that the U.S. could no longer stand by while its ships were sunk, its people endangered, and its values threatened. Congress responded 4 days later on April 6, 1917, with a formal declaration of war against Germany. In the beginner's end, Wilson's journey from reluctant neutral to wartime leader was not simply a shift in policy, it was a transformation of purpose. He envisioned a role for America not just as a participant in war, but as a leader in peace, with a responsibility to shape a better, more just international order. His legacy would be defined as much by that vision as by the war itself. On April 6, 1917, the United States took a momentous step. Congress officially declared war on Germany, drawing the nation into the global conflict that had raged across Europe for nearly 3 years. This decision came just 4 days after President Woodrow Wilson delivered his powerful address to a joint session of Congress, asking them to recognize that the time for neutrality had passed and that America must act. In his speech on April 2, Wilson laid out a case for war that blended strategic necessity with moral responsibility. He pointed to Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, which had led to the sinking of American merchant ships, and he referenced the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany had attempted to incite Mexico to attack the U.S. But, beyond the provocations, Wilson appealed to America's sense of idealism, framing the conflict as a struggle between democracy and tyranny, a chance to make the world safe for democracy. His words struck a chord. After intense debate, Congress voted decisively in favor of war. In the Senate, the resolution passed 82-6. In the House of Representatives, it was approved by a vote of 373-50. Though not unanimous, the support was overwhelming, a clear sign that both the political leadership and much of the nation were now ready to join the fight. The formal declaration of war marked a turning point in U.S. history. It was only the second time America had entered a major overseas war, and it would signal a shift in its global role. From a nation that often stood apart to one that would now help shape the outcome of world events. Public reaction to the declaration was mixed but largely supportive. Many Americans felt a renewed sense of patriotism and purpose, and recruitment offices were soon flooded with volunteers eager to serve. Cities held rallies, flags were raised, and newspapers declared the dawn of a new era. But not everyone cheered. Pacifists, isolationists, and some immigrant communities, especially those with German roots, voiced concern or opposition, fearing both the war's human cost and its potential to stoke domestic tensions. Internationally, America's entry into the war was seen as a game-changer. The Allied powers, Britain, France, and Russia, welcomed the news, recognizing that the infusion of American troops, resources, and morale could tip the balance in their favor. For the Central Powers, especially Germany, it meant a new and formidable adversary had entered the battlefield. The declaration of war in April 1917 did more than send American troops to Europe. It marked the beginning of a dramatic transformation in American society, politics, and identity. The U.S. was no longer just a neutral observer. It had stepped onto the world stage as a rising power, with a mission to not only fight, but to help shape the post-war world. When the United States entered World War I in April 1917, its involvement dramatically altered the course of the conflict. At that point, the Allied powers, primarily Britain, France, and Italy, had been locked in a brutal and exhausting war of attrition for nearly 3 years. Trench warfare, staggering casualties, and waning morale had left Europe physically and emotionally drained. The arrival of fresh American troops and resources provided a critical lifeline and ultimately helped tip the scales toward victory. American mobilization began rapidly and on an unprecedented scale. President Woodrow Wilson and Congress moved swiftly to organize the nation's economy, military, and society for war. The government passed the Selective Service Act of 1917, instituting a draft that eventually brought over 2.8 million men into military service. Another 2 million volunteered. This influx of manpower would prove vital on the battlefields of Europe, especially in the final offensives of 1918. On the economic front, the U.S. government partnered with private industry to shift production from peacetime to wartime needs. The War Industries Board coordinated the supply of raw materials, standardized products, and managed labor relations to avoid strikes. American factories ramped up production of weapons, ammunition, food, and supplies, not just for American troops, but for the Allies as well. Meanwhile, citizens were encouraged to buy war bonds, conserve resources, and grow victory gardens to support the war effort at home. The arrival of the American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, under General John J. Pershing in France brought a fresh sense of energy and hope to the Allied lines. Although it took months to fully train and deploy American troops, their presence alone had a psychological impact on both sides. The Allies saw in them a source of strength and renewed morale. The Germans, on the other hand, realized they now faced a determined new opponent with immense industrial and human resources. By mid-1918, as the Germans launched their final spring offensive in a desperate attempt to end the war before American forces could fully arrive, U.S. troops began to see serious combat. In battles like Cantigny, Belleau Wood, Saint-Mihiel, and the Meuse-Argonne offensive, American soldiers proved their effectiveness. Their courage and determination, despite being relatively inexperienced, helped blunt the German advance and pushed the front lines back. Beyond the battlefield, America's entry into the war sent a powerful diplomatic and ideological message. The U.S. cast itself not just as a military power, but as a champion of democracy, aligning the war effort with Wilson's 14 points and the vision of a lasting peace. This gave the conflict a renewed sense of purpose and helped unify the Allied narrative. In short, America's entry into World War I was a turning point. It brought overwhelming resources, manpower, and industrial capacity to a war that had stagnated. It lifted the spirits of the Allied nations and signaled to Germany and its allies that victory was now slipping out of reach. While the U.S. had entered the war late, its impact was decisive. helping to bring about an end to the bloodshed and reshaping the global balance of power in the process. The United States' entry into World War I in 1917 marked a turning point, not just in the war itself, but in the nation's identity on the world stage. For the first time, America cast aside its long-held policy of isolationism and fully embraced the role of a global power. The political and social aftershocks of this decision would ripple through the 20th century and beyond. Politically, America's involvement in the war was a catalyst for its transformation from a relatively insular republic into an influential global actor. President Woodrow Wilson, who had once campaigned on keeping the U.S. out of the war, now envisioned America as the moral leader of a new international order. His 14-point speech laid out a vision of diplomacy, self-determination, free trade, and most notably, the formation of a League of Nations, a body meant to prevent future conflicts through collective security. Although the League was ultimately included in the Treaty of Versailles, the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the treaty, largely out of concern that joining the League would entangle the U.S. in future European wars without congressional approval. Despite Wilson's passionate efforts, the U.S. never joined the League, a decision that undermined its effectiveness. Still, the idea planted seeds for future international cooperation, such as the formation of the United Nations after World War II. Globally, the war reshaped international relations and redrew borders. The collapse of empires, the Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and German, led to the creation of new nations and the spread of nationalist movements. America, as a victor and a financier of the war, emerged with enhanced prestige and influence, particularly in Western Europe. While it didn't maintain a large standing army or global military presence right away, its economic might and ideological sway were undeniable. At home, the war deeply affected American society and domestic policy. The Selective Service Act marked the first time the federal government implemented a large-scale draft, which brought millions of men into uniform. The government also took unprecedented control over the economy, communications, and even speech. The Espionage Act 1917 and the Sedition Act 1918 criminalized dissent, targeting anti-war activists, socialists, and immigrants. Thousands were arrested for speaking out, and this period saw a troubling erosion of civil liberties in the name of national security. Social tensions flared as well. The war accelerated the Great Migration, with African Americans moving north to fill labor shortages, sparking demographic shifts and racial unrest. Women entered the workforce in greater numbers, strengthening the push for suffrage, which would be realized in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. Immigrants and perceived radicals faced suspicion and persecution, laying the groundwork for the Red Scare of the 1920s. In essence, America's entry into World War I left a legacy that extended far beyond the battlefield. It reshaped the nation's role in global affairs, challenged traditional ideas about neutrality and civil liberties, and began the slow, complicated transformation of the U.S. into a superpower. The war may have ended in 1918, but its consequences, political, social, and ideological, continued to shape American life for decades to come. In conclusion, the road to America's entry into World War I was anything but straightforward. It was shaped by a complex mix of idealism, economic interests, public sentiment, and international provocations. From President Wilson's initial commitment to neutrality to the sinking of the Lusitania, the Zimmermann telegram, unrestricted, submarine warfare, and ultimately the realization that the world was at a turning point, each moment edged the U.S. closer to war. When America declared war on Germany in April 1917, it not only altered the outcome of World War I but also redefined its own role in the world. The decision marked the start of a new era, one where the U.S. would no longer remain on the sidelines of global conflict, but instead step into the spotlight as a major power, influencing diplomacy, economics, and warfare in the 20th century and beyond. What do you think? Was America's entry into the war inevitable, or could neutrality have been maintained longer? Drop your thoughts and questions in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if you're interested in what happened next, check out our videos on the aftermath of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, or the dramatic cultural shifts of the 1920s. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss what's coming next on History Revealed.